There is a moment in the history of paleontology that deserves more attention than it gets. It happened in 1954, when a Soviet expedition working in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia unearthed a set of fossilized claws. Not small claws, not even medium claws, claws that were, individually, nearly a meter long, roughly the length of a human arm from shoulder to fingertip. The scientists who found them had no idea what they were looking at. Their first guess was that they had found the remains of a giant prehistoric turtle, which tells you everything you need to know about how completely outside the normal parameters of vertebrate anatomy these things were. They were not turtle flippers. They belonged to a dinosaur. And once paleontologists eventually figured out what kind of dinosaur, the confusion did not decrease. It compounded. Because the Therizinosaurus turned out to be a theropod, the same group that produced the T-Rex, the Velociraptor, and the Spinosaurus. A group defined almost entirely by fast, aggressive, meat-eating predators with forward-facing eyes, powerful legs, and the general disposition of something that wanted to eat you. The Therizinosaurus had none of that. It was slow. It was enormous. It had a potbelly. It ate plants. And it was carrying around the largest claws of any animal known to have ever existed on land, for reasons that took decades to even partially understand. Evolution, apparently, does not always read the memo. Part of what makes the Therizinosaurus so fascinating and so frustrating for paleontologists is that we still don't have a complete skeleton. What we have is fragmentary. Those original claws, some arm bones, a few additional pieces found in subsequent expeditions. The full picture of what this animal looked like has been assembled partly from its own remains and partly by studying its relatives, a group of dinosaurs called Therizinosaurs that were somewhat better represented in the fossil record. Those relatives filled in a lot of gaps. They confirmed that Therizinosaurs were theropods, bipedal dinosaurs that walked on two legs and were descended from the same lineage as all the famous meat eaters. They also confirmed that at some point in their evolutionary history, this lineage had made a truly dramatic turn away from carnivory, developing broad, flat teeth suited for processing plant material, wide bodies to accommodate large digestive systems, and a general body plan that looked less like a predator and more like something that needed a good long nap after lunch. The Therizinosaurus itself, based on estimates from its bones and comparisons with relatives, was probably somewhere between 9 and 10 meters, or 30 to 33 feet in length, making it one of the largest therizinosaurs known. Weight estimates are harder to pin down, but the consensus is somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 metric tons, heavier than a white rhinoceros at the low end, approaching the weight of a large elephant at the high end. For an animal in the theropod family tree, this is a remarkable size. For an animal in the theropod family tree that ate plants, it is almost philosophically troubling. Let's get back to the claws, because they are genuinely impossible to move past without addressing properly. The four-limb claws of the Therizinosaurus were the longest of any known land animal in the history of life on Earth. The largest recovered specimens measure approximately 91 centimeters or 36 inches in length along the outer curve, and that is the bony core alone. In life, keratin sheaths would have covered that bone, adding potentially another 20 to 30% to the total length, which means the actual claws on a living Therizinosaurus were probably well over a meter long on each hand, 3 of them. To give you a sense of scale, the claws of a grizzly bear, which are already alarming enough to feature prominently in most people's nightmares, reach about 10 centimeters or 4 inches. The claws of a Therizinosaurus were roughly 10 times longer. A single claw from this animal was longer than most people's entire arms. The question of what these claws were actually for has generated more debate than almost any other feature of any dinosaur. And the honest answer is that we still don't have a definitive consensus. The leading theory is that they were used for feeding, specifically for hooking and pulling down branches from tall trees, in a manner broadly similar to what is seen in giant ground sloths, which independently evolved a somewhat similar body plan tens of millions of years later. The Therizinosaurus lived in a late Cretaceous environment that included tall conifer trees and other high canopy vegetation, and claws of that length and curvature would have been extraordinarily effective tools for dragging entire branches within reach of its relatively small head. A second theory is that the claws functioned primarily as defensive weapons against predators. The Therizinosaurus shared its environment with Tarbosaurus, a close Asian relative of the T-Rex that was one of the apex predators of its time, and a set of meter-long claws on arms that were themselves around 2.5 meters or 8 feet long would have made attacking a Therizinosaurus a genuinely risky proposition for almost anything. Even a Tarbosaurus, which could generate a bone-crushing bite, would have had to contend with the possibility of being disemboweled by a single defensive swipe. Most paleontologists currently think the answer is probably both, that the claws served a dual purpose as feeding tools and defensive weapons, and that neither function alone fully explains why they evolved to such an extreme length. What is clear is that whatever the claws were for, they worked well enough that this animal survived and thrived for millions of years, which means evolution knew something here that we haven't fully figured out yet. If the claws are the most dramatic feature of the Therizinosaurus, the rest of its anatomy is arguably more surprising because it represents such a complete departure from everything that the theropod body plan is supposed to be. Start with the neck. Therizinosaurs had unusually long necks for theropods, not quite the comical lengths seen in sauropods, but significantly extended compared to their carnivorous relatives. This made sense in context. A plant eater that needed to reach high vegetation and couldn't easily move around on all fours would benefit enormously from a long neck that could sweep through a wide arc of available food without requiring the whole body to reposition. Then there's the body itself. The Therizinosaurus and its relatives had what can only be described as a barrel chest and a pronounced potbelly, a wide, deep torso that housed the extensive digestive system required to process large quantities of tough plant material. If you've ever wondered why herbivores tend to be rounder than carnivores, the answer is fermentation. Breaking down plant cellulose requires either a very long digestive tract, a very large fermentation chamber, or both, and all of that takes up space. The Therizinosaurus was essentially a walking fermentation vat with claws. The hips were also dramatically different from typical theropods. Where most theropods had narrow hips suited for speed and agility, Therizinosaurs had broad, wide hips that supported their heavier bodies and wider gut. This gave them a stance that was more stable than fast-planted rather than dynamic, built for standing and reaching rather than running and chasing. And then there are the feet. Most theropods were digitigrade and they walked on their toes with the heel raised off the ground, which is efficient for running. The Therizinosaurus and its relatives walked with a flatter foot, more like a bear than a bird, which again sacrificed speed for stability. This was an animal that was not going to outrun anything. It didn't need to. With those claws and that size, it didn't particularly need to run. One of the more visually striking aspects of the Therizinosaurus, and one that tends to surprise people who first encounter it, is that it almost certainly had feathers. Not all over its body, necessarily, and perhaps not the elaborate display feathers seen in some other theropods, but the evidence from related Therizinosaur species strongly suggests that feather-like filaments covered at least parts of the body. This evidence comes primarily from Bepiosaurus, a much smaller and more complete Therizinosaur found in the Yixian Formation of China, which preserved clear impressions of feather-like structures. Bepiosaurus even had two distinct types of feather-like coverings, smaller filaments similar to the protofeathers seen in many feathered dinosaurs, and larger, broader structures that may have served a display function. Given that Bapiosaurus and Therizinosaurus were relatives, the reasonable inference is that the larger animal shared at least some of these features. The image this creates is not subtle. A 5-ton animal, nearly 10 meters long, covered in feather-like filaments, with a potbelly, a long neck, and 3-meter-long claws on each hand. It is one of those animals where the more accurately you reconstruct it, the more it looks like something that shouldn't exist, a creature assembled from parts that have no obvious business being on the same animal. And yet, it was one of the most successful large herbivores of the late Cretaceous in Asia. Success, in evolutionary terms, is the only metric that matters. The ecosystem the Therizinosaurus inhabited during the late Cretaceous, roughly 70 million years ago, in what is now Mongolia, and possibly parts of China, was one of the most intensely studied prehistoric environments in Mongolia. Asia. The Nemegt Formation, where Therizinosaurus remains have been found, was a lush environment by late Cretaceous standards. River systems, floodplains, forests, and a diversity of large animals that made it one of the richest ecosystems of the period. The apex predator of this world was Tarbosaurus bator, essentially the Asian equivalent of the T-Rex, and not a comfortable neighbor for most animals. Tarbosaurus was slightly smaller than its North American cousin, but otherwise followed the same template: massive skull, bone-crushing bite, powerful hind legs, and an appetite calibrated for large prey. In an environment that included Therizinosaurus, it seems almost inevitable that the two crossed paths regularly. How did those interactions go? This is where the defensive claw theory gains real weight. A Tarbosaurus attacking an adult Therizinosaurus would have been facing an animal that outweighed it, had reach that exceeded its own by a considerable margin, and could deliver slashing wounds of a severity that few animals in the history of life could match. There are no definitive fossil records of Tarbosaurus-Therizinosaurus encounters, but the anatomy of both animals tells a plausible story. The predator probably thought twice, and juvenile or weakened Therizinosaurus individuals were likely far more attractive targets than healthy adults. The Nemegt Formation also included sauropods, hadrosaurs, ankylosaurs, and a range of smaller dinosaurs, making it a genuinely complex ecosystem where the Therizinosaurus occupied a unique niche, the largest dedicated herbivore capable of accessing high canopy vegetation in an environment where competition for that niche was essentially non-existent. Perhaps the most interesting question raised by the Therizinosaurus is not what it looked like or how it lived, but how it got there. Tracing the evolutionary path from the small, fast, carnivorous theropods that gave rise to the Therizinosaur lineage to the enormous, slow, plant-eating Therizinosaurus is an exercise in understanding just how flexible evolutionary pressure can be. The shift from carnivory to herbivory in dinosaurs was not unique to Therizinosaurs. Ornithomimosaurs made a similar transition, and of course, the entire sauropodomorph lineage had been herbivorous from very early on. But what makes the Therizinosaur case particularly striking is the extremity of the transformation. These animals didn't just switch diets. They rebuilt almost every aspect of their anatomy, body shape, limb proportions, hip structure, foot morphology, neck length, dental anatomy in the service of a completely different ecological strategy, while retaining theropod features like bipedalism and, somewhat bafflingly, the general forelimb structure that produced those extraordinary claws. The claws are the most visible evidence of this evolutionary tension. A feature that originated in a carnivorous lineage was retained and amplified to an almost absurd degree in an animal that no longer ate meat and ended up serving purposes that the original carnivorous ancestors couldn't have anticipated. It is evolution, repurposing its own tools in ways that produce outcomes nobody predicted, which is more or less the story of life on Earth told in miniature. The Therizinosaurus should, by every reasonable expectation, be better known than it is. It had the longest claws of any land animal in the history of life. It was one of the largest theropods ever to exist. It looked like the product of a dare between competing evolutionary pressures, and it lived alongside one of the most famous predators in Asian paleontological history. Instead, it tends to get overshadowed by its more conventionally dramatic relatives, the T-Rexes and Velociraptors, that fit more neatly into the template of what people expect dinosaurs to be. The Therizinosaurus refuses that template entirely. It is slow where theropods are fast, round where they are lean, plant-eating where they are carnivorous, and equipped with weapons so extreme they confused scientists for decades. It is, in the best possible sense, an argument against the idea that evolution has rules. It has tendencies, preferences, patterns that repeat, but given enough time and pressure, it will produce something like the Therizinosaurus. And the only honest response is to admit that you didn't see it coming. Nobody did. Not even in 1954, staring at a claw the size of an arm with no idea what it belonged to.